My name's Peter Monks. I'm VP of Technology with the Symphony Software Foundation. And today I really wanted to go over just a couple of quick things in this short 15-minute session. First up, for those of you who don't know what Symphony is, I'll give you a quick overview of that. We'll talk a little bit about the role of open source in financial services and the regulated industries. And then finally, I'll tell you a little bit about how we at the Foundation are open for business. So let me start with sort of a quick overview of the Symphony platform. Symphony is a unified communication and collaboration SaaS offering, and it really focuses on intra and inter-firm communication. So it was born and bred in financial services, in the regulated industries, and it was intended to provide the kinds of collaborative capabilities that you might expect from platforms like WhatsApp, Slack, Skype, Microsoft Link, those sorts of platforms. The key difference, however, is that by virtue of being born and raised in financial services, Symphony offers a number of capabilities that the regulated industries expect that those kinds of consumer apps do not offer. So all content and communication on the platform is encrypted end-to-end. There are content compliance and export capabilities provided for compliance officers within banks, for detection of fraud, collusion, excessive gifting, those kinds of capabilities. And of course, we understand the financial services industry by virtue of having customers that are primarily in that industry. The one interesting difference between Symphony and some of the other communications and collaboration networks available for financial services is that the original set of investors viewed open source as a key kind of secret weapon to ensuring the success of both the platform and the company. And to that end, they actually created two parallel organizations when they founded and initially invested in Symphony, those being the Foundation, which is where I sit, and then the LLC, or the corporate side of the house. Now, the differences between the two is that we're really focused on stewardship of the open core of Symphony, the core messaging fabric and technology that supports Symphony. We also look at the broader ecosystem. Perhaps some of you will join us in the coming days, weeks, and months and join the Foundation and collaborate on projects with us. Whereas the corporate side really is a traditional Silicon Valley SaaS startup. They focus on commercializing that open technology, providing value-add add-ons, that kind of thing. Before we move on, though, I'd love to see, just by a quick show of hands, how many of you consume open source in your day jobs? If you could just put your hands up. So it's a little hard to see with the lights, but I'm looking at maybe 50%. And keep your hand up if you also contribute actively to open source. So that's a much, much smaller number. And that's not really a surprise, and we'll see why in a minute. Part of the reason that the consortium of banks that invested and bootstrapped this whole initiative around Symphony chose open source is really this dynamic, which we think Forrester has captured really well with some of their market analysis and research. And what they've found is that really open source gives this kind of way out of the iron triangle jail that we all know so well. This idea that you can pick cost, you can pick schedule, and you can pick features, but you can only get to pick two. And the third one is kind of forced on you by your choices in the first two columns. What Forrester have found is that, in fact, open source lets you dynamically adjust and rebalance that equation so that you can optimize different dimensions at different times in your growth. So the consortium were very clear that open source was going to be a central part of Symphony's development so that it would better suit the demands of the financial services customers that they had. And of course, particularly pertinent to financial services, is the additional benefit that open source has been proven to have a higher quality of output of work product. The software that open source produces is higher quality. And really, this is best summarized by the old saw that with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And in financial and regulated industries, the key thing here is that of security. Security bugs are bugs just like any other. They are also amenable to the many eyeballs equation. So again, there was another benefit that the investors saw, which was the software that this startup that we're investing in produces is going to be of a higher quality because of this natural dynamic that open source offers. Now, that's all good and well in theory, but I think it's more important to actually focus on some hard data. We've been following, we at the Foundation have been following the Black Duck reports, which are done every year. They've been around for about 10 years now, I think. So they have quite a good history going back about a decade in what is happening with open source. And what they've found is that consumption and contribution are really at a high level. Open source is effectively already won. There is by far a large majority of organizations already adopting and not only consuming, but contributing to open source. And I don't think that would be a surprise perhaps to anybody here in the Valley. I think we've all had our interactions with open source either as a consumer or as a producer or a contributor, but the data actually does bear that out. What's more interesting to me is that the last two categories have had more growth in the last couple of years, and I think this is a reflection of the maturity of open source models and open source governance, and that is that there are about 33% of organizations these days that have dedicated staff whose sole purpose is to contribute and develop open source software. So this goes beyond contribution now. We're not talking about raising bug reports, perhaps enhancing documentation. What we're really talking about here is, I see a strategic benefit in contributing to open source. The best way for me as an organization to do that is to pay to have someone work on it full time. And fully a third of firms as of 2016 are now doing that. And then finally, the compliance one is another sign of maturity, which is looking at the non-technical aspects. In this regard, what Black Duck found is that 50% of organizations have formal compliance policies for both the consumption and production of open source software. So they have formal policies around what can be brought inbound and what can be published back outbound. Now that's in general, that's not specific to financial services. This survey that Black Duck do is across the board. I think it's also worth highlighting a good example from financial services, and this was a study that Bearing Point published just in the last little while. It is an example, it's not actually a survey, it's not a large data set, but what they found in looking at a particular trading application that was developed by a large corporate commercial bank is that that bank, at the end of the day, once the trading application was in production and in use, the bank themselves had only invested in about 30% of the code. The rest of it had either come from third-party consumption of open source or proprietary commercial code, and that was a fairly small slice. But by far the biggest contributor was this open source segment where they had contributors from the community joining them and helping to develop that app, kind of almost on behalf of the bank. And so I think it's hard to argue with the economics of open source when you see a case study like this one, where this bank put in 30% of the effort and got 100% of the product out. So how might firms like that bank and perhaps some of you and certainly the firms that invest in us participate or encourage an open source model with their own developments? What we've found is that foundations have really become the optimum model for this kind of open source purist and commercial interactions because they provide a level playing field. And I've thrown up a variety of logos here, some financial services specific and some general. But really the idea here is that foundations are a good model for fostering and supporting open source development. And that's why we exist at the Symphony Software Foundation. We are a foundation that really stewards the Symphony Open Core platform. And to do that, we really have offered to date a number of core capabilities. Obviously, open source is the first point. We provide project hosting, security reviews, vulnerability scans, release management, all of the things that you would expect from a typical source code hosting infrastructure. And all of that is done under an Apache 2 open source license, so it's free to consume for anybody out there who wishes to consume it. We also have a focus on open standardization. One of the things we've found with Symphony is that in exchanging these collaborative messages, it's really important that people agree on what is being discussed and how it's represented. So we also foster working groups, and these working groups typically focus on interoperability and standardization issues. And then finally, we've always done all of the things that we do with a transparent and open governance model. And that's really important to really further support this idea that it's not just that we're producing open source, but the method of production itself is open and transparent. And that's a core cultural value that we at the Foundation and many other open source foundations hold very dearly. However, I'm actually very pleased to announce that today we've just launched kind of the fourth finger, if you will, in our open source journey. And that is an open developer platform. The open developer platform, which as I say we launched earlier this morning, is really in support of producing that open source code. Symphony itself is a reasonably complicated SaaS application. Standing it up on your laptop is not necessarily something that a developer wants to do, when really their goal is to develop an integration or an extension or an app or a bot or something that runs on top of Symphony. Their goal is really to build that with as little cost as possible and focus on getting as much capability into their code as possible. Standing up this complex environment goes well beyond what the average developer wants to do. So recognizing that issue, and we've had this developer platform in beta for almost 2 months, today we're taking the lid off and making that available to all Foundation contributors. So if you've contributed a project or contributed to a project that the Foundation hosts, then you have free access to this developer experience and this developer environment. What that will allow you to do is to develop all of the things that can be built on top of Symphony against a pre-installed, pre-configured, hosted environment.